80-year birthday today. Hello, everybody. My name is Brandon, and this is the Daily Dope Show. The Daily Dope Show, whatever you want to call it. I've been on here for about a year now, talking about the drug war. And wouldn't you know it, most of the stories are about weed still. No surprise. We're fighting this battle. Normal, who's been fighting it for like 40 years, they've always been kind of like a good window into exactly how to frame what's going on and how we can fight it, how we can try to turn it around. They're responsible for the early efforts to legalize medical marijuana, especially. And overall, they're always there to help you when it comes to legalizing marijuana. So Paul Armentano, the deputy director of Normal, he's the only one that wrote an article about this, I think, today. Maybe I only Googled it one time. But yeah, this is what I found, and I also pulled another article that he wrote quite a while ago, about almost 8 years ago now. The one where he's talking about the failure of the 40-year-long drug war as posed by Nixon. So we'll go over the finer points of that in a minute. But what you got to understand is that even on day one of this policy to essentially prohibit the sale of marijuana, or make it so anybody that bought it was breaking the law. They had these tax stamps or whatever. Since the day one of this, they've never really figured out a good constitutionally sound way to word the federal law. So they invented this thing called the Controlled Substances Act, and they stuck it in there under the most dangerous thing that you could be, like right next to heroin, something that a tiny, tiny amount of it could kill somebody. And with no medicinal value, and a propensity for addiction, a high propensity for addiction. This is a tactic that they had to resort to continue to demonize cannabis, because quite frankly, there's no real reason why cannabis should be illegal. And they know that. I don't understand why to this day we have prohibitionists that are basically foaming at the mouth to go after cannabis. We have a police apparatus in this country that looks more like a occupying military force that's primarily used to bust marijuana doors in, quite frankly. Yeah, that militarized police you're always talking about. You only ever see them out and about when there's a marijuana bust or when there's a fucking riot. Even when there's a riot, they try not to come out with too much militant looking shit going on. You don't want to see cops walking around with AR-15s at a riot. But you'll see them walk into a fucking house and shoot someone's dog for a fucking weed bust. And that's kind of what's going on, man. We've had 80 years of this failed policy that pits law enforcement against consumers. Not just any average consumer, not just a specific group of consumers or a demographic per se, but by and large, this has been used to go after black people, black men. This has been a racially charged drug war the whole time it's been around. That's why alcohol prohibition didn't do so good, because the victims of the alcohol war or whatever, back when that prohibition was going on, the people that were looked at as who the cops were targeting, the white gangsters that were rich. They just had to find a way to get those guys to be legitimate. In this drug war that we're in, yes, unfortunately, minority communities are basically being policed by military-style policing, raids all the time. We're hearing all the time also about these raids being deadly or these raids being uh, used as an excuse to shoot a dog. I mean, I'm not saying that the whole reason they did the raid was to shoot the dog, but every time they come to the house, they shoot the dog. It's just, it's insanity. Um, I don't I'm kind of getting sidetracked here, but what I'm talking about is a failed policy, one of the worst failed policy, probably the worst failed policy this country has had ever. Well, I mean, not you can go back to slavery and say, well, that's a pretty fucking bad failed policy. I would say you're right, but at the same time, there's more black men incarcerated right now for low-level nonviolent drug offenses than there was slaves, I think. It might be overall black inmates total, but if you look at the percentage of these people that are getting locked up and you say, oh, no one's getting locked up for possession. Yeah, they are. Even if you're just not possession of like one joint or something, or if someone had a half ounce, all of a sudden they're a dealer, or even if they are a dealer but they only had 2 joints on them when they got caught. So whatever, man. The drug laws have been disparaging towards the minority community. No one can deny that. Just look at the fucking numbers. And it's not just cannabis. It's the whole drug war. It's all bullshit. There should be no criminal penalties for fucking drugs. It should not be a thing. Now, if you want to say that the sale of drugs by people that are not authorized to sell them or whatever can be a crime, you can figure that out, you know. How'd you do it with Al Capone? You went after him for tax evasion. I mean, whatever, man. The prohibition is a failure. The prohibition of marijuana is the worst failure that we've seen. Let's read the Paul Armentano write-up. 80 years ago today, on August 2nd, 1937, President Franklin Roosevelt signed House Bill 6385, the Marijuana Tax Act, into law. The act for the first time imposed federal criminal penalties on activities specific to the possession, production, and sale of cannabis. Now, people might say, well, FDR, he was one of the most awesome presidents ever. He saved us from the Great Depression and, hell, got rid of alcohol prohibition or helped to. Well, I don't know. You got to look at what was going on at the time. The Democrats weren't the same party they are today. Not that they're really much better, but they were definitely awash with corruption. They were the bankster, gangster party. The other person involved in this prohibition, besides Harry Anslinger, was this Representative Robert Doughton of North Carolina, also a Democrat. So, like I've always said, and I'll keep saying it until we actually see some proof otherwise. Now we've seen Democrats from Tulsi Gabbard to the guy from Oregon, Wyden, to like, Cory Booker. We're all, all these Democrats talking about legalizing marijuana, and maybe a couple Republicans here and there, once in a great while. Not very common. But most of those bills are just put out there in earnest because they know they're not going to see the light of day, and they just have to stake out their position for whatever reason. When I think about the current list of people that are involved with this, besides like Patrick Leahy, obviously, and Dana Rohrabacher and a couple others, but the ones that have put the most provocative ones forward were like Tulsi Gabbard and your Cory Booker type. They're also people that keep getting floated around by different people and different groups as being like possible presidential candidates for 2020 to go against the Trump. So I don't know. I don't know how deep to look into that. But besides that, I've always said Democrats are not your friends. If they were, they would have got rid of this. This shit would not have ever happened. let alone still be a thing with all the Democratic presidents we've had between now and then. I mean, Jimmy Carter tried. Lord knows he tried. All right, so Congress's decision followed the actions of 29 states. So what they're saying is that the states were already doing their own laws against cannabis, starting with Massachusetts in 1914. And it was basically, I think those were more of a commerce type thing. Like people wanted to reel in people just being able to grow unfettered amounts of cannabis, and like money don't grow on trees, man, whatever. So they wanted to rein it in. It wasn't like the reefer madness wasn't coming from that movement, but there was already industries that were trying to squish hemp that we can look at if you look at some of the other states involved in the laws that were being written before then. So anyway, it also followed years of reefer madness, during which time politicians, bureaucrats, led primarily by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Director Harry Anslinger, I'm sure everybody's heard that name before, reporters and science editors continually proclaimed that marijuana use irreparably damaged the brain. In a 1933 editorial in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, largely summarized that sentiment of the time. Quote, if continued, the inevitable result is insanity, which those familiar with it describe as absolutely incurable and, without exception, ending in death. So yeah, reefer madness, man, come on. On April 14th, 1937, Representative Robert L. Dalton of North Carolina introduced H.R. 6385. Which sought to stamp out recreational use of marijuana by imposing a prohibitive federal tax on all cannabis-related activities. Members of Congress held only 2 hearings to debate the merits of the bill, which largely relied on the sensational testimony of Anslinger, who opined, the drug is entirely the monster hyde, the harmful effects of which cannot be measured, over objections from the American Medical Association, whose representatives opposed the proposed federal ban. Members of the House and Senate overwhelmingly approved the measure by voice votes. Another one of those shady things that happened during a recess, I believe, or right before one, like I think during like almost Christmas or at the Christmas, right before the break, where everybody already went, hopped on the train. There was only a few people there. It doesn't matter. Like it says, the American Medical Association was objecting. And I remember reading from those hearings, and I believe what happened was that Robert Doughton and other prohibitionists were basically having like a kangaroo trial with the hearing. And every time somebody from the American Medical Association said something, they just kind of laughed it off. And then they even went so far as to recommend that you guys can think of a clever way to write your way around this so that you could still make your your medical marijuana shit, because that's what they were fighting to keep. Is they were like, yo, how are you going to say all of a sudden anything that has to do with cannabis is completely illegal when the top 3 things that are prescribed in the American pharmacopoeia was cannabis derivatives? We'll never know, because they'll never answer that, because they don't have to. They never had to. And that's why this is an unjust and totally unconstitutional action by the government in 1937. So it's just total horse shit. And you might think of Roosevelt as some kind of progressive or whatever, or maybe. So even though he made it illegal, when he reared his head again in 1941, he signed an executive order legalizing hemp production for the war effort. Basically, hemp could be used to make rope, oil, and other essential World War II materials. And his administration was so desperate for it that they even, desperate for it, they even released a short film called Hemp for Victory, which encouraged farmers to grow the essential crop. Roosevelt's America gave us both pro-cannabis Hemp for Victory as well as the anti-marijuana movie Reefer Madness in 1936. And that contrast might be a perfect way to sum up FDR's contradictory words, beliefs, and actions when it came to the prohibition of social vices. Because if you remember, he made a lot of cool quotes about, you know, prohibition of alcohol. And he basically helped make the prohibition of alcohol go away. A new look at why pot prohibition fails. And this is a couple years old, but it's worth looking at because I couldn't really find direct numbers or anything. So this kind of gives you like a psychological overview of the failures, basically. Marijuana prohibition is a failure. It's a failure in a matter of evidence, not a matter of opinion. After all, it's been in effect for 80 years now, and the marijuana is more popular now than ever. That's evidence. But why is it a failure? There's lots of reasons. First of all, marijuana is not really the dangerous drug that it's portrayed to be when Prohibition was enacted. And then Prohibition failed to eliminate marijuana commerce. In fact, the problem got worse. Law enforcement was prepared for a battle over illegal marijuana sales and use. That was to be expected, but in some respects, the desire for this battle is why Prohibition was enacted in the first place. What was not expected was that the United States would become one of the world's largest producers of marijuana. There was a Paraguay scare when crops in South America and Mexico were sprayed with this insane Monsanto pesticide, herbicide, and it just killed weed plants or it poisoned them. So that's when people started growing in America because they found out that it was illegal to spray that shit on American soil or whatever. So anyway, originally large-scale cultivation began in California, Oregon, and Hawaii. The federal government responded with proportionately large-scale eradication program, relying on paramilitary squads and extensive aerial searches with helicopters. Cultivation spread to the other states, followed by the eradication program. Growers began to rely on smaller plots and responded to other tactical developments. For example, when the government began to aggressively use forfeiture proceedings to seize land used for marijuana cultivation, some growers began to use public lands, such as national parks and forests, for marijuana plots. Eventually, marijuana cultivation not only spread to all 50 states and the District of Columbia, it also moved indoors. Nowadays, the cultivation of marijuana in the U.S. is so extensive and so decentralized that it's practically impossible to prevent and impossible to eliminate. Marijuana prohibition is not only a failed strategy, it's not really a strategy at all. It's one of those never-ending wars, That's what they like nowadays, wars that never end. It's good money for, them all the time. First, consider a simple definition of strategy. A strategy produces a sustainable competitive advantage. Prohibition is a strategy that provides an advantage for law enforcement and other politicians, and for politicians. It is successful in terms of providing a pretext for funding, political support, and power. However, that's not what the ultimate source of funding, political support, and power, was offered. The public was sold on a program that would promote public interest in reducing teenage access to marijuana, reduce drug abuse, and promote public safety. With respect to these three objectives, marijuana prohibition has not only failed, it does not even provide a viable plan of action for success. Marijuana prohibition is not a plan of action. It's really more a goal masquerading around as a plan. Prohibition is like maximizing shareholder value. It represents a desired state, but it really doesn't explain how that will be reached. In these terms, prohibition is just a series of utopian slogans like drug-free America. Serious policy analysts will disagree. They will concede that prohibition is rhetoric, but that's the nation's drug policy actually consists of a sophisticated strategy of balancing efforts in both the areas of supply and demand reduction, and that the modern approach has a prominent emphasis on prevention and treatment. Yes, that is a plan of action that can reasonably be described as a strategy, but that's not what opponents of marijuana legalization emphasize when they advocate their preferred course of action, which basically means they want to spend more money on cops and build more prisons. While offering support for prevention and treatment programs in response to drug abuse problems, opponents of legalization prefer to keep the supply side of the policy package just the way it is. They defend maintaining prohibition with justifications that include concerns that legalization would increase use and arguments that keeping marijuana illegal is important in order to discourage greater use. In other words, when it comes to prohibition, the defense continues to be utopian slogans, a collection of vague objectives without any concrete plan to actually achieve them. It is as if the noble intentions of the prohibitionists alone are supposed to be sufficient for them to prevail. Strategy is a plan that provides a sustainable competitive advantage. Prohibition cannot, and will not provide a sustainable competitive advantage against the operation of a vast, extensive, unregulated, and profitable illegal market in marijuana. Opponents of marijuana legalization refuse to face this fact. This is why prohibition has failed, and this is why opponents of marijuana legalization are also failing. What is the sustainable advantage of prohibition? It gets money and power for police departments, and it gets votes for politicians. The votes for politicians racket is falling apart, as 61% of the country wants legalization. Soon after that, the money and power it provides for police departments will also fade away. But when it comes to the public, people are realizing across the nation that prohibition provides them with no advantages at all. That's why prohibition is a failure. It doesn't do the public any good. And I've heard somebody else say something along the lines of, prohibition basically is an attack on consumers of recreational drugs, just, the ones that they don't approve of. Or basically the ones that are approved of don't like, or whatever. And I've heard them, talk about the drugs that you can basically make at home or grow at home, or natural, you can find in nature. So, once again, Paul Armentano. Here's Roosevelt signing something. That's what he looks like when he signs a bill. He didn't look like he was super happy about it. Anyway, just days after the White House released their inherently flawed 2010 National Drug Control Policy, or strategy, the Associated Press takes the entire U.S. drug war strategy and rakes it over the coals. It's about time. It's about damn time. So their article is called Impact After 40 Years, $1 trillion, U.S. war on drugs has failed to meet any of its goals. After 40 years, the United States war on drugs has cost $1 trillion and hundreds of thousands of lives. And for what? Drug use is rampant and violence is even more brutal and widespread. Just ask Mexico. Even U.S. drug czar Jill Kerlikowske concedes the strategy has not worked. In the grand scheme, it has not been successful. Kerlikowske told the Associated Press, 40 years later, the concern about drugs and the drug problem is, if anything, magnified, intensified. No shit. Seriously, if you care about drug policy and marijuana law reform, you must really read the entire AP analysis. It's that good. You know what? I might put the link to that in the description for you. In 1970, hippies were smoking pot and dropping acid. Soldiers were coming home from Vietnam hooked on heroin. Embattled President Richard Nixon seized on a new war he thought he could win. Again, I don't think he ever had any delusions that he would win a war. He just found a new thing to use to take people's rights away, especially his political enemies, the hippies that were protesting the war, and the black community, particularly the Black Panthers and other activists that were, enemies of Nixon and his administration. Quote, this nation faces a major crisis in terms of the increasing use of drugs, particularly among our young people, Nixon said as he signed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. The following year, he said, quote, public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. Now, you can take the words drug abuse out of this sentence, and Nixon injected every drug there was in that same sentence. Public enemy number one in the United States is marijuana. Public enemy number one is LSD. Every other week he had a new public enemy number one and a little speech behind it. Anyway, his first budget was $100 million. Now it's $15.1 billion. I believe after all the raises that Obama gave the DEA, the DEA alone gets like $21 billion a year. So anyway, yeah, we're way up 31. We're like 50 times more than Nixon's budget at this point. Using Freedom of Information Act requests, archival records, federal budgets, and dozens of interviews with leaders and analysts, the AP tracked where the money went and found that the United States repeatedly increased budgets for programs that did little to stop the flow of drugs. In 40 years, taxpayers spent more than $20 billion to fight the drug gangs in their home countries. In Colombia, for example, the United States spent more than $6 billion, while coca cultivation increased and trafficking moved to Mexico, and the violence along with it. I mean, just look what they did with Afghanistan, man. This is 2010 shit. I bet you none of this even mentions what we did there and how much that cost, because that's not direct drug war expenditures. That's just like general military spending. All right, $33 billion in marketing for the Just Say No style messages to American youth and other prevention programs. Ooh, shit's boring, ain't it? High school students report the same rates of illegal drug use as they did in 1970. And the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say drug overdoses have risen steadily since the early 70s to more than 20,000 last year. Apparently this is an old article. Yeah, this is 7 years old. In that 7 years, that number has increased from 20,000 to now 60,000. It's unbelievable, out of control. And by the way, cannabis has nothing to do with that. And the only thing that you can justify the DEA spending more money on every year, you can't, because they're not doing anything to stop this. They're the drug enforcement agency. All the people that got fentanyl mouth spray that wasn't supposed to because Insys Therapeutics, like drug pushers, like shoved it into their... Yeah. That's what the drug war don't do. It don't fix the actual problem of these people dying from opioid deaths. $49 billion for law enforcement along America's borders to cut off the flow of illegal drugs. A lot of good that fucking did. This year, 25 million Americans will snort, swallow, inject, and smoke illicit drugs, about 10 million more than 1970, with the bulk of those drugs imported from Mexico. $121 billion to arrest more than 37 million nonviolent drug offenders. About 10 million of them for possession of marijuana. There you have it. And that's like 1/4 of the overall number. Now, this is the federal numbers only, I believe. Studies show that jail time tends to increase drug abuse. I wonder why. They don't even have a way of keeping the drugs out of the jails. $450 billion to lock those people up in federal prisons alone. So between enforcement and lockup fees, shit, you're over $500 billion just in locking up your own citizens for fucking nonviolent drug offenses relating to marijuana mostly. Last year, half of all federal prisoners in the U.S. was serving sentences for drug offenses. And I believe 60% of that number is cannabis. So it's a pretty big fucking number, man. They lie whenever they say it's like 18 to 21%. That's foolish. That's some bullshit. At the same time, drug abuse is costing the nation in other ways. The Justice Department estimates that the consequences of drug abuse, quote, an overburdened justice system, a strained healthcare system, lost productivity, and environmental destruction, cost the United States $215 billion a year. Harvard economist Jeffrey Myron says the only sure thing taxpayers get for more spending on police and soldiers is more homicides. And more people getting killed by cops, too, by the way. Quote, current policy is not having an effect on reducing drug use. Myron said, quote, but it's costing the public a fortune. And yeah, these homicides are because you basically make the black market so, where the money's so good, that's when the crime starts happening. That's when people get robbed. That's when people start shooting each other. That's when people become gangs. And So-called war on some drugs, which is really a war on consumers of certain temporary mood-altering substances, mainly marijuana, cannot survive if continually faced with this kind of scrutiny. Even the drug czar, when faced with the actual evidence and data above, folds his cards immediately, acknowledging that U.S. criminal drug enforcement, quote, has not been successful. Yet apparently neither he nor the majority of Congress, the president, the bulk of law enforcement officials, or any of the tens of thousands of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. have the stones to stand up and put a stop to it. And that is, and always has been, the problem. And that was, again, Paul Armentano. And, yep. I mean, I can't say it's a happy birthday. It's a sad fact that this country is so dumb and weak and doesn't have the leadership needed to churn this shit around. Never has. This was written during the Obama administration. So if you think Obama was good for marijuana policy, bullshit. He wasn't good enough. He was just kind of rising with the tide of legalization and trying not to stand in its way because he didn't want to be known as somebody that on that particular issue really pulled a surprise like 180. But overall, 80 years of prohibition. It's a sad day that we're still here, we're still fighting, and we're still hoping that battering ram don't pound the door in, and this whole dream of just being able to do what you do because you do it because the state that you live in says it's legal. All of a sudden all that comes crashing down because the federal government under Jeff Sessions' evil, commands, all of a sudden starts getting this attitude that it's time to crack down on weed again. And that's what it's been like for 80 fucking years. Billions of dollars just poof into the air. And law enforcement, half of law enforcement's sentiment is that we're done with this, let's move on. Whereas the other half are like, let's keep doing it. Like, we love it. We love taking people's rights away. We love kicking people's doors in. We love using marijuana as a way to demonize victims of police brutality. And most of all, like we've been hearing about and seeing evidence of time and time again, this is a war against the minority community in this country, and it's putting law enforcement against the minority community as if it's like they're two enemies on a battlefield. So I'm not saying that white people don't get arrested for marijuana, or that it's unheard of, or the cops refuse to do it or whatever, because people are getting tickets all the time, man. Every 40 seconds someone gets a marijuana ticket. Shit's got to stop, man. All right, that's all I got on this, guys.